Hello, I'm Kieran Lynch and welcome to Teagasc, the Teagasc Sheep Podcast. Each episode will bring you latest insights, advice and technical updates for the sheep industry. In the current episode we're going to focus on housing management. To do this I'm joined by Sheep Specialist Damien Costello, who discusses some of the key management issues we need to pay attention to over the coming weeks during the housing period. Damien also discusses the importance of feed management, as well as ways to improve efficiency of the housing system on your farm. We're going to focus a bit on winter management in this podcast, specifically key management aspects of housing. To do this, I'm joined by Damien Costello Sheep Specialist. Damien, thanks for joining us.
Thanks yourself, Kieran.
Damien, look, winter management, housing is an important element for many flocks. A lot of flocks are in earlier this winter. Some will be housed in the next couple of weeks that haven't already housed. What are a couple of key management issues we need to be careful of when we're talking about housing and sheep?
Yeah, in terms of the housing itself, Kieran, I suppose the feed space would be obviously an important one, that all ewes must be able to comfortably eat concentrates at one time. And they also need a constant access to hay or silage or whatever roughage they're feeding. There's also considerations in terms of lying space requirements. They needed access obviously to clean water supply at all times. The housing needs to be well ventilated. Look, there are other issues in terms of access for machinery and feeding and so on, and the appropriate lighting and power availability, but those are the main ones, I suppose.
All the practical things that will influence efficiency, I suppose, of the feeding system too, but maybe we'll tease some of them out a little bit. Space is probably the first one that will hit us when we're penning up ewes. Feed space in particular, we know can be an issue, particularly in late pregnancy. What are the kind of key requirements for feed space?
Yeah, well, again, as I said earlier, it's important that all ewes can eat concentrates comfortably at one time. And the Department of Agriculture have guidelines in their specifications on what the feed space requirements are. So if you take in terms of concentrate feeding, if we take the example of the medium-sized ewe, 70 to 75 kilograms, they require about 500 millimetres per head of feed space. It's also, I suppose, important to bear in mind, particularly with twin and triplet bearing ewes, as they come nearer to lambing, they're getting that bit bulkier as well, so maybe there's need for extra space at that stage.
That requirement could be a bit more than the 500.
It could in the last few weeks of pregnancy.
And that's for mealing. I suppose the other thing, in some of them pens, we often don't take account of the feed space. It's particularly if you're using walkthroughs, we do lose area in some feeding setups as well that's not taken into account. Well,
exactly. In the case of the walkthrough trough, we'll say at the corner where there's a corner there, probably about 600 millimetres should be allowed, where the last ewe at the other side is more or less blanking off some of the walkthrough trough. So look, it's a worthwhile exercise to do, is to actually measure the length of the feeding space and do your calculation to see, have you the appropriate amount of ewes in that pen, or looking at the other side, is there enough of feed space for the number of ewes you have in the pen, and making allowances, as you said, for the corners where that are blanked off.
And it's supposed to be fair going by eye at the moment. Look, mid-pregnancy they're not going to be as big as they are in mid-pregnancy. You need to give them a little bit extra. And you'll avoid issues, other issues in late pregnancy, such as prolapse or twin lamb disease and so on. The guidelines are fairly close to the mark on that one. In terms of roughage, we don't quite need that level of feed space, but there's still management issues around how we feed.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the guidelines would show that there's substantially less feed space needed for roughage. However, I think it's very important that they have constant access to that roughage, that you're not allowing it to run out and then give them a big feed. So from that point of view, maybe you need a good bit of feed space. Again, it's important that the ewe will be selective in what she'll eat, so they'll be leaving certain bits of the material behind. So we would say that you'd need to be cleaning out that stale material twice a week at least. And the other thing, I suppose, as well, in terms of feeding management, that you don't allocate too much, so that you're not piling it in front of them and it can start to heat and that kind of thing. So maybe daily allocations, and making sure that if they're pushing it out from them, that it's kept up to them at all stages.
You're trying to avoid spoilage, and again, your latter point there is relevant for those feeding hay. Silage to an extent they don't push away as much.
Exactly. Hay, particularly with hay, you'll find that they'll tend to nose it away from them, and it needs to be pushed in maybe a couple of times a day. Silage less of a problem, as you say.
Look, I suppose to be fair, most of the problem or most of the issue, limiting factor, is feeding space, but lane space is also very important.
Yeah, well, again, the department have similar guidelines on the floor space requirements. Again, going back to our 70 to 75 kilogram yaw, if they're housed on slats, the guideline is that 1.1 metre squared per head is the space required. Whereas it's slightly higher on bedded sheds, it's 1.2 metre squared. Obviously, if you're dealing with bigger framed yaws, 85 to 90 kilogram yaws, they require more line space, whereas smaller type yaws will require a little less.
The difference there, look, you mentioned bedded sheds. I suppose ventilation was something that came up earlier too. For some producers facing into a longer winter, the usage of bedding, well ventilated, a lot of these factors can influence how much straw you're going to use for the winter.
Absolutely. I mean,
there is other health aspects ventilation is important for too, but it's just one that kind of jumps up.
Absolutely. As with any livestock housing, a well ventilated shed is important, and I think a quick check anybody can do on their shed is if you look at the underside of the roof. If there's dust particles and so on sticking to the underside of the roof, it's probably a sign that there's some ventilation is somewhat compromised, really. And what's happening is that there's some condensation due to poor ventilation on the underside of the roof, and that the dust particles that are in the air are sticking to it, really. But again, as you said, it's very important from a health point of view. It supplies kind of oxygen-rich air to the building. It removes kind of gases and odours and any other bacteria and so on. And as you mentioned, it also removes moisture from the air. So that is what has the big effect on your bedding.
Like particularly in sheep, a lot of buildings are adapted to suit them. Sometimes they need to go back maybe and do small renovations or small adaptations to just address some of them issues.
Well, absolutely, and even from I suppose the basics of the ventilation is really that when there's sheep in the shed, they're producing a certain amount of heat. Warm air is rising, so that's where your outlet ventilation comes in. That this warm air goes out through the roof, either through space sheeting or through the roof canopy, and this is replaced then by fresh air coming in, generally from the long side of the building.
Maybe that kind of tees up. Look, ventilation is one part of reduce maybe overall straw usage, but it's important to still come out with enough of it. Hygiene is another issue. Even in mid-pregnancy, it's important to keep the fleece clean, keep the pens clean, try and minimise the level of bacteria there. The importance of how do we address that, particularly for those who are going to be housing for a long period, keeping hygiene levels good, either on slats or on a straw environment. Maybe straw first.
Yeah, well, if you take the straw first, again, as you say, keeping the underfoot conditions as dry as possible really is the aim, so that you're topping up the straw bed regularly. You're keeping it monitored. As you mentioned earlier, there, if you feel that it's difficult to keep the straw bed dry, there may be issues with the ventilation, and as you said, it may be simple changes, like maybe raising a couple of sheets on the roof to allow the moist air to escape better, or some of those simple enough to do things can help the situation. But it's important that you are using an adequate amount of straw so that you're maintaining hygiene conditions. If you take the slat situation, I suppose in general, the big issue I suppose that arises with the slats is particularly with long chop silage, where they tend to be pulling in a good bit of the silage, and that can block the slats, and you can even reach the situation where you have to wash out the slats during the housing period. You can, I suppose, keep an eye on that as well, and maybe just to collect, every day or every second day, maybe collect any waste silage that has been pulled in and is in front of the slats before it gets to the stage of actually blocking the slats.
Just keeping an eye on that time, maybe.
Absolutely,
small bit of tidying as you go every week.
Exactly, keeping it under control before it gets too bad.
Just like a latter bit on hygiene, but particularly maybe more adaptable, and it's important to keeping water clean. during that period, and I'm thinking more whether there's batch drinkers in pens as opposed to smaller drinkers. Sometimes take the eye off them mightn't be a massive issue when they're on a lot of forage, but when we introduce concentrate, water requirement does become very important.
Absolutely, and as you get through the later stages of pregnancy and your concentrate feeding level has been stepped up a bit, I suppose water can become more critical at that stage. In the weeks before lambing, the ewe can be consuming up to 6 litres per day of water, and it's probably even more after lambing. If there's a lack of water or a lack of clean water, I suppose more specifically, it suppresses appetite, and that can cause its own problems. So it's important not alone to have the trocks, but to monitor them regularly to make sure that they haven't been soiled or that kind of thing, and to clean them out fairly regularly. Again, with higher litter sizes, you also have a greater water requirement. So it is important, from a nutrition point of view, but also from a welfare point of view, that fresh water is available to them at all times.
Probably want to keep a tie hang on us after a frost if the water's not actually running in the mornings.
Absolutely. I mean, you can have hard frost where the pipes are frozen, and you're feeding high levels of concentrates at that stage. So it's just one to keep an eye on.
David, we might just switch to another aspect of it. Look, we often don't consider the labour input that goes in around housing and feeding. Sometimes forget how easy it is when they're out in the field just eating grass here. But in terms of improving efficiency, a lot of these are existing mills. We're not talking about new builds here, but we've often seen sheds and feeding systems that can be modified to leave it a bit easier. What are a couple of key things we should be maybe paying attention or investing in?
Yeah, and as you say, for relatively small investment, the I suppose as we said at the outset, the objective should be really that that one person can feed the sheep without entering into the pen. So I've seen cases where, for example, they invested in a few walk-through troughs or something like that, where it allows you enough of feeding space. Very often in buildings that have been maybe converted or that kind of thing, you've lots of floor area, but where you may be limited is in terms of feed space. So introducing maybe a few new feed barriers or a few walk-through troughs can it's worth considering in terms of making your shed more user friendly, if you like, and that very often people have a limited amount of time to get these jobs done on a sheep farm, so it's more efficient.
Leave it as simple
as possible. Exactly. Yeah.
I'm thinking too. Look, it's coming up to scanning them too. Penning is obviously another big important issue.
It is. Yeah.
Some don't still have adequate penning, but it is important. We talk about winter feeding large lambs, high birth weights, higher mortality, maybe as a result.
Absolutely.
Sometimes we'd overlook what simple little management like increasing penning or having enough pens available.
Well, that's exactly it. I mean, as what you're talking about there might be just simply putting in a few extra dividers so that you get smaller groups of sheep. As you said, what we'd be saying is that yours first and foremost must be grouped according to litter size, so that single, twins and triplets are grouped separately and fed according to litter size. The other thing, particularly where farmers are particularly keen on changing rattle colour fairly regularly, you can also group them according to predicted lambing date based on the rattle colour. So, as you said, you need a good number of pin divisions in order to achieve that.
And just thinking even condition score would be another one they could nearly throw in that carry. But basically having enough of pens on the facilities there allows you to make them manageable.
Well, absolutely, yeah. And as you say, on the condition score, I mean, it may be appropriate if you go through your twin bearing ewes and there's a number of them behind on body condition, they could be moved into one of the triplet pens in order that they are on a slightly higher feeding regime to build body condition in the lead up to lambing.
Okay, Damien, I think we covered a lot of ground there. We will catch up with you on a later podcast. We'll talk a bit more about facilities at lambing and some of the key things we need to look for there. It'll tie into this one nicely. Covered a lot of ground, some very basic points we need to look at when we're talking about housing and some issues we might want to address. Damien, thanks for taking the time to join me.
Thank you, Kieran.
We're going to wrap the episode up at this point. I would like to thank Damien for taking the time out to join us and offering us his insights on some of the key management issues that can occur during the housing period. He also offers some very practical tips that can be implemented on farm. I think most will find very beneficial. Again, don't forget to subscribe and tune in for future episodes. For all other updates on our sheep programme and for upcoming events, keep an eye on our Twitter page at Teagasc Sheep. I'm Kieran Lynch, thanks for listening in, hope you join us again.